Good evening again, everyone, and thank you so very much for joining us on this roundtable discussion here on Jones Communications Network. As we proposed, we're discussing the United States elections, which will come up on November the 5th, 2024. Competing will be two candidates, former President Donald Trump and Vice President Kamala Harris. Mrs. Kamalafi, let me start with you. How interested do you think Bahamians are in the United States elections, as a general rule?
Absolutely interested. I think it's an extension of who we are as a people. One thing is certain with the Bahamas, we're going to tune in during the presidential elections, and we're going to tune in during the midterm elections. Not so much so state elections and local government elections, but certainly when it comes to those two big ticket items in the United States, Bahamians are 100% zoned in.
Mr. Butler, you've lived and worked in the United States, former executive director of the Inter-American Development Bank. You worked in the heartbeat of the United States, Washington, D.C. You still have considerable contacts there. Do you agree?
Yeah, I mean, I think that if you look at it from an entertainment perspective, when you think about contact sports, I hear my friends regularly argue about whether the Miami Dolphins will win. And now that we have baseball and we have a Bahamian on the New York Yankees, so that type of sports connection is pretty much also tied to our political view of the United States. We view it as contact sports. So from that perspective, the country is a leader. And when the country is a leader and you're a follower of that leader, you absorb certain attributes. So in the case of the Bahamas, for me, it's going to be three attributes: socio, cultural, and economic. So when I, as an intellect or as an economist, view the relationship between Bahamians and Americans and the relationship between the Bahamas and the U.S., I look at it in those three contexts: socio, economical, and cultural. And remember also, a lot of our cousins, brothers and sisters, live there, and so they are affected familiarly with our familiar ties with them.
Mr. Arruda, should Bahamians be interested?
Absolutely. They're closest neighbor to us, and U.S. policy, both domestic, which is unusual, affects the Bahamas, and their foreign policy affects the Bahamas. The U.S. also set the tone for the globe and for us, who watch a lot of their programs on their TV, on where we're moving in terms of our culture and our behavior and accepted norms. Behaviors that were accepted in the Bahamas now were first accepted in the U.S. And we are influenced by their television shows and what they push on us, or out there to the world. And so we should be very interested. They're our trading partner. We import so much of our goods from them. Bahamians think it almost as a rite of passage to travel to the U.S. So we're so connected to them. Bahamians even now celebrate Thanksgiving, which is a uniquely American holiday. And Bahamians go to the States for Thanksgiving. In the Bahamas, they now celebrate it. And so we should be interested in what's happening there, because it helps to point the compass that we should either follow or reject.
And Mr. Trinquest, your contribution in that first question: should Bahamians be interested in the United States elections?
I think so. The economy of the Bahamas, to a significant extent, is dependent, as you know, on tourism. A significant sector of that comes from the United States. They would be the largest contributor to our economy. We all have children, relatives that live in the United States. Some Bahamians think that they are Americans, and that's fine with them. But yes, seriously, whatever happens in the United States has an impact on the Commonwealth of the Bahamas. If things are going well in the United States, usually they're going well here. And so in a presidential election and in some extent to congressional elections, the Bahamas is a beneficiary or a victim of whatever happens.
Let me ask you, of course, you made mention of the potential implications of those elections. And we're not just talking, I presume, about, whether it's former President Donald Trump or Kamala Harris, but rather Democrats and Republicans. Is there a difference whether one or the other, for the Bahamas' sake, is in the White House?
Well, I think so. I think that Bahamians emotionally would find themselves more attracted to the Democrats for any number of reasons. Barack Obama was a Democrat. Kamala Harris, who is a young black lady with Jamaican antecedents, etc., is someone whom Bahamians would feel that they can relate to. It doesn't mean that people in the Commonwealth of the Bahamas would not necessarily relate to someone who was not black, but these are people who we have a connection with, and so it's understandable that our people would be able to relate to them. But Bahamians, understandably, are very good international voyagers, and whoever is president or vice president or senator or congressperson is someone with whom the Commonwealth of Bahamas, the residents, would be able to relate to.
Mr. Butler, you work there. You work in the Cardigan of the United States, the American Development Bank, and you crossed administration while you were there. Did you see a material difference for the Bahamas depending on the administration, Republican, Democrats?
Yeah, I did. And, having gone across the Obama administration and also gone across the Trump administration, it's always interesting to see how your personal contacts in the White House changes, your ability to be invited to certain events changes, because there's a huge change. And also, it's also interesting to see the perspective in terms of your need to educate and re-educate the new administration on why the Bahamas isn't just, I think at one time I sat through a congressional hearing and we ought to take this seriously, for a new ambassador. And he referred to the Bahamas in that hearing with me present as being a protectorate of the United States. So I think what we ought to take seriously is one simple fact, and that is that the United States has not had an ambassador here since Her Excellency Nicole Avant more than 13 years ago. And she became a good friend, and I've always asked her why no one else has returned. I think it says a lot about your country and where you factor in U.S. Thinking and politics if the U.S. has not appointed somebody consequential to serve in the post of ambassador. And yes, it is very important when you're in that particular space like Washington, D.C., representing a group of Caribbean and Latin American countries, that at every point in time when you have access to the White House, you inform, you educate, and not entertain, but you make friends. So when things hit the fan, like a blacklisting out of Europe, or quite frankly, a crisis in Haiti, you have to try to carve out where you can stand both for the Caribbean and, more importantly, for me, for my own country, the Bahamas. So yes, it does make a difference from going from one administration like the Obama administration to going to another administration like the Trump administration.
And Mrs. Komalafi, even though, in terms of parties, there might be some subtle differences, or as Mr. Butler indicated, some significant difference, there's that particular individual, that personality, Donald Trump, Kamala Harris, is going to add to a particular flavor attitudinally towards the Bahamas, do you think?
I think so. And I think when we look at the Bahamas historically, whether it was a Democratic president or a Republican president, we've had a strong economy. We had some good times under Clinton, but we also had some good times under Reagan. We had some very good times, double-digit growth under Carter, right? But we had some challenging times under Obama. And you cannot look at the U.S. economy in a vacuum. It wasn't necessarily because of what was going on in the United States under Obama, because Obama was experiencing growth. But we had to look at the external factors during the Obama administration. We were dealing with an economic downturn. It was a global economic downturn. The greatest, they call it the Great Recession, right? The greatest recession since the Great Depression. And I think when you look at the history of the Bahamas, dating even back to the 1960s, under the leadership of the late Sir Roland Simonet, we had some good times. In those days, we were having double-digit growth, 10% year after year, right? But in this particular election, I think it is going to make a difference because you cannot look typically at the economic policies in a vacuum. Now, historically, the Republicans, they're going to cut taxes. They're going to cut taxes on the wealthy. They're going to give tax breaks in corporate taxes, which is what Donald Trump is proposing. And the Democrats, in typical fashion, they're going to raise taxes on the wealthy to the extent that they're even introducing a new tax, unrealized gains. You know, those are on persons who have a wealth over $100 million. They have these portfolios, these assets inside these portfolios, and they're not selling them, so there's not going to be any realization on those assets. And so she's proposing a tax on that. But if we look at economic policy just in a vacuum, then we're going to miss the boat with that, because there's also the trade policy that is being proposed by Donald Trump, for instance, in this particular election. And then there's the immigration policy. And I don't think persons are paying sufficient amount of attention to that, even insofar as we in the Caribbean and Latin America is concerned. Because with the trade policies, Trump is proposing to raise taxes on importing goods that are not made in America, 10 to 20%. Could get as high as 60%, particularly on Chinese goods. Well, if he's going to do that, that is going to raise the cost of inflation. And many economists have already come out and said that his particular economic plan, based upon the trade policy that he's proposing, is going to send the United States into a recession because of those tariff increases. Well, that's a concern for us, because when you look at the United States now, they have done a good job in getting their inflation rate down from 7% post the pandemic to a comfortable 2% now. They're in the 2% range. And so that means that the cost of goods are coming down, which is good for us because we import. And all of those goods are already transported to us. The Fed just cut the interest rate by 50 basis points in September from 5.3 down to 4.8, and they propose another 25 basis points in November and another 25 basis point in December. So they're feeling comfortable that they've gotten inflation under control. And this is a combination of Biden policies as well as the tax policies from Trump that are still in place but won't expire until 2025. But if Kamala is successful on November 5th, we can expect a continuation of Biden policies. We can expect certainty. We can expect similar policies that we're seeing now under Biden. But with Trump, with what he's proposing from a trade perspective and even from an immigration perspective, and maybe we can get into that later, there's going to be uncertainty, and even in foreign policy. So we cannot look at just the economic policy of both these individuals, because this is a specific case with Donald Trump, who has a different mindset compared to his predecessors, Reagan or Bush 1 or Bush 2 or even Gerald Ford or Nixon. He is a different specimen that we're dealing with in this particular elections.
In terms of that, Mr. LaRoda, we'll get to, but in terms of that, Mr. Trump is a friend of the Bahamas. He at one point owned the properties on Paradise Island. And he still speaks very fond. I remember when I was in the administration under Hubert Minnis, you know, he was speaking very, very comfortably about.
He's always been.
So do you think that, you know, his blanket policies with regard to tariffs or whatever they may be, would necessarily, in terms of immigration, and I'm happy that Mrs. Kamalafi indicated we will be talking about that a little bit later on, would you think that with him in the White House, despite the fact that the Republicans may be oriented to a certain kind of outcome, that it would be different with him?
I have no concerns about Trump being in the White House because he's been there before. See, an economist could project and say this and say that. That's their view, that's their opinion. It may be informed, but that may be their opinion. When Trump was elected the first time, I think was one of the economists predicted that America would go into a recession immediately. What happened? One of the greatest economic boom in American history. So he was there before. So we don't have to guess what's going to happen or wonder what's going to happen. Under him, inflation was 1.4%. It went up to over 9% under the Biden administration. And the Feds had to cut the rate to loosen up the economy to bring the inflation down. When you see the Fed cutting the rate, that is an attempt to ease inflation so that the economy could do better than it's doing now. So I don't have any fear of Trump, because under Trump, the economy was good in the U.S., it was good in the Bahamas. Republicans and Trump have the same attitude. They don't try to put restrictions on Americans hiding their funds in offshore banks or engage financial services outside the country. The Democrats trying to keep the money in the U.S., make it more difficult to keep the funds there. That negatively impacts our financial services and our offshore banks. If you look at our history, when we get blacklisted by the U.S., it's always under a Democrat administration. They put the pressure on the Bahamas to fall in line to make sure that their taxes are straight. But we would want a more open relationship, more freedom, so that our financial services and our banking industry could improve. We would want a growing U.S. economy, so our tourism, we could get more tourism and we could do well. I have no fear of Trump, because I know Trump is there, and it's second to that, and maybe perhaps even more important for the world. Trump was the first president in 40 years not to start a new war. The cost of goods and fertilizers and farming went sky high because of the war in Ukraine, which was the second provider of fertilizer for the entire world. And so you have war in Jerusalem, the Middle East with Israel. Iran is there. Putin is threatening that if this doesn't calm down, it'll be World War III. Under Trump, there was no such thing. In fact, we had peace agreements between Israel and Egypt and other countries, the Abraham Accord. You had a world understanding that there's a strong man in place. We're going to operate in a certain way. And if you get out of line, there may be certain consequences. And the tariffs were just used as a tool to keep everybody in line. And that's how I see it. Like I said, I've experienced the Trump presidency, and for me, it was good for America. It was good for the Bahamas.
Well, I'd like to pick up with you. Welcome to join in and just,
Yes,
please go
if I
ahead.
can, Mr. Lloyd, I'd like to push back on the inflation argument. The inflation got as high as 7% in the aftermath, and that was in the aftermath of an extraordinary event, which was the pandemic, right? And that was a challenge, that was a global issue. Inflation was a global issue, and a lot of that had to do with the demand, supply and demand, as it related to global trade. And the ability to be able to get goods in and at the cost and at the time lines that they were coming in. The second point I want to push back against is the financial services argument and the blacklisting. We're not blacklisted by the United States of America. We're blacklisted by the OECD, multilateral agencies like the OECD and the FATF, which are heavily European influenced, and for our financial services industry, which has a heavy European presence. You saw this push towards small island development states. They've branded us as tax havens. We don't see ourselves as tax havens. We actually see ourselves as an international financial center, and we've been in banking for decades. But nevertheless, they have branded us as that, as this haven for the wealthy, particularly those of Europe. And that push came in the aftermath of the economic downturn, where there was this shortage of funds in a lot of these European countries who were running up these very high deficits, very high national debt, and Europe was on the brink of collapse. And so they had to do something to either get a lot of those funds back on shore, those persons who were avoiding tax, because we don't help persons to not pay their taxes, but we help them with their tax planning. They wanted to bring those funds back on shore. So when you see those push that is challenging our financial services industry, yes, America is a part of the OECD, yes, they are a part of the FATF, but when we are blacklisted, it is by these multilateral agencies who come together after their particular
But
meetings.
with all due respect, I'm not speaking about that. Every Bahamian remembers when a former prime minister, Negro, flew into Washington when there was a Democratic administration who was putting the pressure on the Bahamas. We had to change our laws, get a lot of things done to comply with the request of
The FATF.
that was under Bill Clinton. I'm not referring to now. In fact, I resent greatly now that the European countries threaten to blacklist us, and they compete with us unfairly. They have the Cayman, that's England, right? They have Turks and Caicos, that's England, and they threaten us to conform to make us less competitive with their territories, and we are a sovereign country. So I always ask the Bahamian people, when they come to try to blacklist us and threaten us, stand up with whatever our government, whether it's FNM or PLP, whoever's in power, stand with them and don't go against your government because the outsiders trying to influence our financial policy domestically. Let's stand with our people and stand proud.
Just one potential correction, and I'm not suggesting that what you're saying is inaccurate, but Mr. Ingram had to travel basically around the world in order to facilitate the change. You remember the compendium of financial services legislation back in 2000. So,
And that pressure had to do with anti-money laundering
That-
and counter-terrorism financing.
I mean, Ms. Canlafi is correct about the international agencies and the blacklisting. And where the U.S. stood in that particular process is always interesting if you understand that the U.S. has Delaware and the
Exactly.
U.S. has Colorado. And the easiest place for me to open up a bank account with cash is Miami, okay? Which Bahamians routinely do and can't understand why in the Bahamas it takes more than 3 months to open up a bank account if you have a client who has a business license, okay? So that's one other thing. The other thing is it's interesting to hear what Mr. LaRota is saying, and his thesis is Mr. Trump is a known quantity. And I'll just say in my line of business, which is high finance and wealth planning, I always begin with a caveat with all of my clients, which Lester is very familiar with, and I say, past results are not indicative of future performance. So I will leave that caveat with you, and I'll just say, a man who is that old and has that much to deal with from his past, and he tells you when I come in office, I will spend my time dealing with all my past transgressions, is a fellow who has told you that whatever happened when he was in the past, he's out to deal with that in the future. And if you want to deal with that type of man, God bless you. If you want to deal with the uncertainty associated with a different type of reality, then fine. I've developed a kind of moral compass on how I see a person and what I think about a person, and having been in the presence of that person, I always find it interesting that when I had to advise a head of state how to deal with that person, the most important thing for me was always begin your conversation by saying, you're not staying at the Marriott or you're not staying at the Hilton, you're staying at the Trump Hotel because it is the best hotel in Washington, D.C. And all meetings lasted more than 2 hours, and all meetings went very fine because it began with that compliment of the personality. So I found it very interesting during the debate when Ms. Harris raised the point that the world leaders are laughing at you because all they need to do is ingratiate you, and you rise to the occasion. And that is a particular technique when you're an advisor at the foreign affairs level to heads of state who are meeting with any particular character. You know, you find out who their wives are, if they have more than one wife. You find out who their children are, etc. Economic policy and all these other matters don't make a hell of a blue if when you're meeting with that particular head of state, if you can't say, well, how's your new grandchild doing? All right? And that's how you begin a conversation on these things. So personalities matter. The other stuff around a candidate also matters, but there is a particular perception of what happened and what happened back then. And as your grandmother used to say to you, the good old days wasn't always good, eh? I lived through COVID, and I lived through sitting at home doing absolutely nothing. And I lived through driving through Miami Beach at 2 o'clock in the morning, the hottest spot, right? Being stopped because you're violating curfew, and not one restaurant or bar was open, and it was silent like you were watching a zombie movie. I lived through that, and then I hear people say the economy was booming, it was great. No, we had a COVID pandemic and nobody went anywhere and everything was shut down. And whether that was during the Trump administration or not during the Trump administration because it was his fault, it happened during that period. That's the reality of when that administration was in place. His other stuff is mostly just reminiscing and watching Fox News over and over tell you the numbers are what they were. And Ms. Kamlafi is correct to correct the numbers on inflation by indicating inflation is a factor of demand and supply.
Well, you know, one of the things that I found interesting was when the U.S. had put the Bahamas under pressure. That is, the civil servants had put Bahamas under pressure because of the blacklisting, et cetera, and Trump intervened and indicated that the basis upon which they had reached their conclusions with regard to the Bahamas and others, that he was not in favor of that. And so the reality of it was that while the other countries might have been annoyed with us and would have wished to do certain things, Trump instructed, as I recall, the Treasury Department to use another method in assessing how they came to that decision. And of course, his assessment, stated up front, was that he didn't feel that their basis for reaching that conclusion was accurate, and that we were being improperly treated. Now, I don't know what he would say today because it's very unpredictable.
Lester, in the blacklist was the United States Virgin Islands, Puerto Rico, Delaware. If you ever are the president of a country like the United States and some foreign country chooses to blacklist any state or territory that you are the master of, you must stand up.
You got to defend it.
You must stand up. And if, as part of defending that, the Bahamas ends up into the defensive trap, God bless the Bahamas, you're lucky.
I agree.
You know, so
I agree.
this misunderstanding of someone that, you know, this U.S. elections in one sense or form should teach us that how we treat each other as Bahamian and how we operate in the Bahamas as a financial sector, you know, like offshore wealth and all that stuff. No, how do the three large Canadian banks treat you when you go for a loan or when you go to open up a bank account? Or how does your treasury treat you or your Ministry of Finance treat you when you want to try to get a business license or a tax compliance certificate, right? And how is it when Ms. Kamlafi later on starts to talk about immigration, right? How is it that it seems like in the Bahamas, being a Bahamian is a deficit? Because all my foreign friends, right, with money, right, live a pretty, they won't go anywhere else but the Bahamas, and they can't wait for these U.S. elections to take a different turn, so they could say, I'm applying for citizenship, I'm moving here, it's great, etc. So the most important and consequential thing for me out of this elections is, I hope Bahamians learn that we must learn to treat each other like who we are, which is, we on our own. And if we don't make a way for each other to boost this economy and make this economy into what it has the potential to be, then we could keep looking over there at what they're doing and hoping they'll give us some scraps to keep us going.
Thank you very much, Mr. Butler, for allowing us to segue into the immigration issue. And I'll start with Mrs. Kamalafi, because, you know, Mrs. Kamalafi, there are lots of Bahamians who are living in the United States, some illegally, some with special status, some with temporary status. And there's a major concern in the hearts and minds of some of them as to what happens in this general election. Not only that, of course, in terms of immigration, Bahamas now enjoys some privilege that most of the rest of the world doesn't, and that is, you know, pre-clearance. What impact do you think either of these candidates potentially would have, certainly on those that are living in there? And we've got family members, daughters, this, that, and so on. And also our ability to freely move from the Bahamas to the United States. I think it was one of our panelists who said there seems to be in us an inalienable right to travel to the United States.
Yeah.
Well, I think one thing is certain in the United States, immigration is a priority issue. There was a poll that said that 55% of Americans think that it is a very important issue and the border should be protected. Both candidates have articulated their position on the border, but Trump is polling higher than Kamala is. Kamala's argument is that Trump encouraged his colleagues in Congress to strike down the bill that would have assisted the Biden-Harris administration with addressing the immigration issue. That particular legislation would have allowed them to give the resources that were needed at the border to be able to strengthen the borders and police the borders, whether that was through asylum officers or whether that was through more
Judges.
Yes, judges in the courts. And other things that she has articulated is that they would like to be able to invest in do public and private investment in Central America so that they can reduce these pressures on the borders. Trump's position is that we have allowed, the United States have allowed, under a Biden-Harris administration, the most, and statistically it is the most, persons that have crossed the border illegally. They're saying some 8 million persons that crossed the border illegally on the Biden-Harris watch. And he wants to shut the borders off completely. Not only does he want to do that, he has indicated that he was asked a question by a reporter if he wanted to be a dictator. And he said, no, not really, but just for one day. On my first day, I want to be able to get all of the undocumented, all of the illegal persons out. I'm going to carry out the biggest mass deportation program ever. Again, if we go back to economic policy, and this is why I say we cannot look at it in a vacuum, because again, economists have come out, Nobel Prize winners have come out and said that to be able to cause this upheaval in the American economy is going to have a significant impact on the economy. And we're only concerned about the United States insofar as was already indicated. They're our #1 trade partner. If Americans are doing well and they have more disposable income, that bodes well for us. That means more of them are going to get on ships and come here, and we could continue to brag about record-breaker tourist numbers. More of them are going to come here and they're going to be stopover tourists, which will get more heads and beds, and perhaps we can revert to a time when we used to have U.S. investment in the country, where more persons will come and invest in the country, and we have seen a slowing of that over the years. But the challenges that they face there with immigration, and Trump, in his campaign, he is saying, well, we've opened these borders, the narcos are coming in, all the narco traffickers, they're coming in, and they're also human trafficking, and there are hundreds of thousands of persons who have gone missing as a result of human trafficking. So many are saying it's a campaign that's based on fear-mongering, but the reality is the positions are starkly different on immigration. And if you just take into consideration the MAGA rally that was held at Madison Square Gardens on Sunday, and some of the commentary that came out of there that really didn't focus a lot on what Trump himself had to say, but what persons before him had to say, whether it was directed toward Puerto Ricans or whether it was directed toward blacks or whether it was directed toward Latinos. There is a growing concern in America, particularly on the Democratic side, that Trump wants to change everything that is American, that they're this great melting pot that have allowed so many different ethnicities and nationalities to come together. And he's moving toward this pro-nationalistic approach where America first, which nobody would fault that. But the challenges of the complexities of the American economy and the way they've built themselves up to be leaders in the global world, it makes it that much more difficult to roll back what America has finally become, or what America is today and continues and wants to be. And so the immigration policy, again, relating it back to the Bahamas, you cannot look at just the economic policy in the vacuum, or even the trade policy in the vacuum. You have to look at the immigration policy, because based upon how each candidate intends to address the issue, it's going to have an impact on the Bahamas and our relations with them and trade, because again, it's a trickle-down effect. Nothing operates in isolation.
Mr. Roda?
Yes, well, first I want to say I don't watch Fox News, so I just want to make that clear, because I think there was a comment made about watching Fox News. As far as immigration go, I find it interesting. Bahamians are perhaps some of the most xenophobic people on the planet. We complain about illegal immigrants. We say deport the Haitians back. Some people
Just on the board of mine.
yeah, just to the point of my own. And, we say all kinds of things. We want our border protected. We put a lot of pressure on whichever government is in power to protect the borders of the Bahamas. We say we're a sovereign country. If you come to the Bahamas, come through the legal means. So if another country is saying, if you're going to come to our country, come legally. We want an orderly process to control our borders, and your migration to our country should be in our interest. We should have a part in it as well. It isn't just for your benefit. It's like with us in the Bahamas, we import skilled labor a lot. And we ask those skilled laborers to pass on their skills to our people so that we could grow and we could learn. The next thing is the bill was an immigration bill, not particularly a border bill. And 6 Democrats voted against it. When President Biden came in, they had the House, they had the Senate, and the White House. If you're telling me you have the House, the Senate, and the White House, and someone who is not in power recently voted out to stop your bill from going through, that to me is a sign of immense weakness.
Well, it's called politics, because you're not going to fix an issue. You're not going to have an administration fix an issue that you do not want fixed. Because now you're running on that issue in the 2024 campaign.
The 6 Democrats, including Bernie Sanders.
6 Democrats, just 6?
6 Democrats voted against the bill. So what I'm saying is,
Only
it
6.
isn't Trump who stopped the bill. You had the House, you had the Senate, and you had the White House. Get them 6 Democrats in line, and your bill would have gone through. Right? And that's their problem. Blame Trump, blame what you are going to do. We don't like excuses. If your time to lead now. You got a mandate from the people to get something done. The truth is, they never wanted the wall. They wanted a more open system, and that's, I think, in vogue now globally. Our children are being taught daily, you're a global citizen. Nationalism isn't pushed like it used to be pushed. You're not just a proud Bahamian anymore. You're a proud global citizen. We're all one people. It's all a melting pot. Freedom of movement has been pushed for by the powers that be for years now, right? And now we're seeing the countries that have opened up their borders and let all of these people in. They're having a tremendous amount of issues now. The Germanys, some of those countries in Northern Europe. And so now people are rising up and saying, enough is enough. When you're a nation, you're defined by your borders, your language, and your culture. If you import people in mass, without restrictions, without the proper protocol, without legally, you impact your language and your culture. And you create conflicts between groups of people because you didn't manage them coming into your country.
Except for the fact that that's different in the American context.
Just give me a moment. We have to get to a break here this evening. Thank you very much, ladies, gentlemen. We are here at a special roundtable discussion talking about the United States upcoming presidential elections. We'll take this break and come right back.